Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our pre-concert video for Holland Symphony's concert on March 22 of 2025. And we are calling this concert the Scottish Influence because the two book-ending pieces for this concert are both by Mendelssohn and both inspired by Scotland. So it's probably best to start talking about those title pieces first. We're going to open the concert with his overture to the Hebrides, as he called it, the Hebrides Overture. He also called it Fingal's Cave. It's a little bit confusing. We'll get into that in a minute. And then we'll close the concert with his third symphony, which is actually his last symphony that he wrote, which is subtitled the Scottish Symphony. So a lot of artists and musicians and writers were inspired by Scotland in the 1800s and often wanted to try to travel there to find some inspiration. It was sort of seen as a mysterious place. The weather is foggy and misty. The scenery is gorgeous. Scotland has this sort of dark political history that was far in the past. Legends, people speaking a language that seemed unintelligible to many Europeans. And so Mendelssohn was fascinated by Scotland, along with a lot of other people of his day and a lot of other people now. Often young people, young adults, if they had the means to do so, would go on a grand tour of Europe as sort of considered to be part of their education. And Mendelssohn was from a family who could afford to do that. So he and a friend took a trip, multi-year trip tour of Europe, and one of the first places they went was Scotland and England. Really delved into some of the history of Scotland, toured some of the significant sites where Queen Mary was held, eventually made their way to the Hebrides Islands, specifically the island of Jaffa, which is on the west coast of Scotland, and visited Fingal's Cave, which was a place on this uninhabited island that I have not been there. Have you been there, Johannes?
I have not, but it's not very often that you can put the title of a work that we do into Google Maps and it will give you a result. So if you put Fingal's Cave into Google Maps, it will show you the rock, it will show you the island, it will show you the cave. So I have not been there in person.
So I have not been there, not been to Scotland in person, but this cave is gorgeous and huge and has been described as sort of a natural cathedral. And there's a Gaelic name which means Cave of Melody. And I think the way the water splashes and the sounds reverberate in this cave, it was just on everybody's bucket list to see, everyone who could get there. And Mendelssohn was so inspired by that cave that he wrote the opening bars to his overture. When I think of Scottish music, the first thing that comes to mind for me, being a violinist, is the Celtic fiddling, and some of the jigs and reels and that kind of music that we associate with Scottish music. That's really not what Mendelssohn had in mind, and not what a lot of those artists had in mind. They were much more drawn to the moody, temperamental, dark, misty, tumultuous history of Scotland. And both of these pieces are largely in minor, and they really reflect that sort of moody music, dark, a little bit ominous, brooding, introspective. Lots of fun to play, tricky to play. So, Johannes, I'm a little curious. I was thinking we have not done a Mendelssohn symphony and Holland Symphony since probably your early time with us. We have done Symphony number 5.
Number five.
So they were numbered according to the publisher, or when they were published.
Mhm.
So Symphony number 5, he actually wrote quite a bit earlier than Symphony numbers 3 and 4, which is the Italian. But why haven't we done any Mendelssohn symphonies lately?
Yeah, so it's interesting. You mentioned Scottish influence. I could have also called this a program Scottish Sandwich, but Scottish influence sounds a little bit better because we're sort of having these big pillars of the repertoire, and then we're squishing the stuff in the middle and sort of digesting it all together. Mendelssohn is very complex. In my mind, there is romanticism, lyrical lines and all of that that you would associate with, Schumann or Brahms even. But there's a certain lightness in classical texture that Mendelssohn is famous for. And this lightness comes with precision articulation, not unlike Mozart. So it is very, very complex music to play well. So it requires a mature orchestra that has some skill to do Mendelssohn symphonies very well. And probably number four, his Italian symphony, is the most famous, but it's followed right afterwards with the Scottish Symphony number three. So I've been looking forward to doing this for a while, and I'm just glad that we get a chance to do it now.
I am too. I've wanted to play this for a long time. Mendelssohn was significant, and these pieces were significant. The overture was probably one of the first pieces of what we tend to call programmatic music. So usually before this time, overtures were written to, it's sort of the orchestral showcase at the beginning of an opera or a ballet. He called this piece an overture, but it's really a standalone piece. We might even call it a tone poem. Those are
Mhm.
pieces with a pretty flexible structure, and they are meant to tell a story or depict a geographical place or really point to some sort of program, um, describe something artistic. So this piece was really written to capture this place, this cave, and in the Hebrides Islands, and Mendelssohn really does a marvelous job with the romantic lines and the sentiments and the light texture, describing the water splashing on the walls, the sort of surging of the waves, the echoes of this wonderful cave. So really draws quite a wonderful picture, paints quite a wonderful picture through music.
And he does that sort of by evoking, images, right? It's if you remember, our audience may remember, Respighi's Pines of Rome. There are actual birds that you have to play like from a tape, right? Or when you do something pastoral, you get a clarinet to actually plays a bird. But here, you don't hear like a wind machine, or you don't actually hear water waves, right? You kind of get a feeling, right? And he does that by sort of layering these textures, right? So the Hebrides Overture opens, with this rolling, undulating theme, I think in the violas and cellos. And then the bassoon comes in, and so it's all very dark, right? You imagine like black water because the inside of the cave, there's no light. And so there's this vastness and mystery and dark water, and it's sort of like echoes, right? And then this undulating theme sort of pushes forward and creates motion. So it is really, it's really amazing imagery. So it's like reading a good book. You get images, whether or not, they reflect the actual cave or not. It's very descriptive. It's sort of like a good book, I would say.
Hmm. Hmm. So Mendelssohn wrote the initial theme while he was virtually at the cave. It sort of came to him there, and he wrote the overture not too long after that. Similarly, on that same trip to Scotland, when he was visiting one of the places that Queen Mary was imprisoned, he sort of heard the opening theme to the Scottish Symphony. I suppose the difference with that was he didn't actually write that. He didn't write that piece until for a good 10 years. So both of he was in Scotland in 1829, 1830. He wrote Hebrides in 1830. He didn't finally write the Scottish Symphony until 1842. So I think he traveled a lot of other places. He got really busy launching his career. He wrote a lot of other things, but always had this Scottish theme nagging him in the background. So it's a really exciting symphony. It's in four movements that are played more or less continuously. There's not much of a break between movements, so that's a little bit of an extra strain on the orchestra. We don't get a break in between movements. Um, Much of it is sort of dark and brooding. Mendelssohn really writes wonderful melodies that just draw people in, musicians and audience. So it's wonderful to be able to experience these wonderful melodies and harmonies together. Um, Perhaps the most Scottish sounding movement would be the last movement, which is has a very snappy rhythm. Although the title, the tempo marking he gives it would suggest it's something to do with soldiers or war. So it's got the snappy Scottish rhythm, but it's almost a militant feel, as if soldiers going off to war. So you've got sort of both two little flavors of Scotland in that last movement, as well as the sort of brooding and misty and um, mood for the whole piece, sort of describing the landscape and the weather, recalling some of these legends and history. Um,
The last movement, I kind of, it's maybe a little bit more plain, but I think of like Braveheart, right? Because of the Scottish, history. So I feel like there is, this hymn that the brass plays. It's almost like a victorious coronation hymn, right? So like this fight for independence, that's still not over, right? Every now and then they take a vote, do we still want to be part of the UK? So there's sort of this urge, for freedom in Scotland still. Um, but yeah, I feel like there is, almost like a battle scene, and this hymn-like sort of stately, um, the brass is not used. In Mendelssohn, the brass is used sparingly, right? It's not like part of a deep texture, but it sort of comes when it's important. He is a lot more focused on winds and strings. So it's a very interesting movement, the last one that you mentioned. But also, what's interesting is that the second movement we would expect like a slow movement that's kind of romantic, adagio maybe. But he doesn't do that because the first movement is so dark. It's almost like, what we learn in music school about two forms of sonata, right? Sonata da chiesa and sonata da camera. So when you write something for the court, the first movement is always light. When you write something for the church, the first movement is always slow, right? So this almost has a little bit of religious character that the first movement is so dark and brooding. You couldn't possibly do a second movement that is slow and romantic, right? So that's why he does the scherzo in the second movement, which is typical Mendelssohn fashion, light, and you have to have the spiccato bow, and it's all very delicate. And then the heart of the symphony, I think, is the third movement, which then, it's this romantic line, and that is the third movement. So that's a little bit unusual.
mhm. It's very tricky for the string players, so I can attest to that. Uh,
Yep.
so I think all of us are working pretty hard. So in the middle of this Mendelssohn Scottish sandwich, we have two other wonderful
Mhm.
pieces of music. The second piece on the program after Hebrides is a movement from a string quartet by Florence Price. And this movement has been arranged for string orchestra, so we'll feature the string section. Florence Price was an American composer, who wrote mostly in the early 1900s. Was born in Little Rock, went to school at New England Conservatory in Boston, taught in Atlanta for a while, settled back in Little Rock, and then when things got really challenging, with issues of segregation in Little Rock, the family moved to Chicago, and that's where she really found her place as a musician, pianist. She also played the organ, and especially as a composer, and wrote at least 300 works. Was very prominent in her day. Was the first um, Black American composer, woman, to have a piece performed by a major symphony orchestra. The Chicago Symphony performed one of her symphonies. Is really an important voice in American classical music. Like so many others, brought together many traditions, spirituals, some jazz, really borrowed heavily from Dvorak's language. When she died, though, a lot of her music got lost and fell out of circulation. And I think, musicians, we often will joke about, being in Europe or somewhere and discovering some some treasure of music in somebody's attic, some long lost Beethoven symphony or something. And with Florence Price, that actually happened. In 2009, someone bought a house in outside of Chicago in one of the suburbs. It's a house that Florence Price used, and literally found 200 pieces of music in a box in the attic. And so many of these pieces are recently published, and one of those pieces was this string quartet. So it's sort of fun to be able to bring this old and yet brand new piece to life. It's very much in the language of the Romantic composers of the rest of this concert. I think you'll really enjoy it. It's a change of texture. A lot of the rest of this music is, as Johannes was saying, is that very light, delicate, very intricate texture. And there's some of that in the price, and there's just some beautiful slow music. So we look forward to introducing you to this piece, this marvelous piece. Um, Johannes, have you
Yeah, and
conducted this before?
I have not. It's been on my to-do list. So when I first drafted the program for, this concert, which was like 3 years ago, this was, on my rep list to do. And I actually heard it first on a recording with Riccardo Muti in Chicago. So he does a lot of service for Florence Price because when the small orchestras do it, it's fine. People discover, composers that should be performed more, but it's not until the big boys do it that it really reaches a national audience. So Riccardo Muti is really somebody who champions Florence Price and especially conducting the Chicago Symphony to do pieces by her in Chicago, I think is really important. What I also like about what's unique, I think, is how we're talking about Mendelssohn's textures with the orchestra, right? How he invokes a certain spirit, and when you hear this lightness, even if it's an unknown piece, you would say, well, this is very Mendelssohn-esque, right? And she has a special gift, I think, for taking, as you mentioned, Dvořák, the classical European tradition and sort of fuse that with the richness of the African American spirituals and folk melodies, right? To a much heightened degree than Dvořák Ninth Symphony, for example, where we say, oh, the second movement there is maybe an African American inspired theme, but you have to really look for it. Here it is, there's call and response, movement, and greater expressive abilities with sort of deceptive cadences that she puts in there that are reminiscent of spirituals. So it's really amazing how she handles a traditional orchestra. We don't have any saxophones in it, or we don't have any auxiliary instruments that sort of give us more color. It is the traditional orchestra, and she's able to find these colors. And especially in a piece that's arranged for a larger string section, you have a much deeper, richer experience than if it were just a string quartet. Nothing against string quartets, high art form, but it's when you have more strings, it just gives a certain gravitas to it. And yeah, so we have recently done quite a few works by Florence Price. We try to do our part and help elevate this composer more. And this is just a gem, that fits this program nicely and works within our Scottish sandwich.
Yeah, this is the latest piece on the program, written in 1829,
Yeah.
but certainly sounds, borrows from the language of the Romantic composers. So I was going to open this by saying every piece we're playing for the rest of our season is from the Romantic period, which isn't technically true because of this Florence Price, but the language is very very much fits with the Romantic composers. So the other part of this, the other slice in the sandwich is the violin feature solo, Saint-Saëns introduction and Rondo Capriccioso, and we're so happy that Letitia Japp is joining us. She's been in West Michigan for a few years. She's teaching at Grand Valley. She plays in Holland Symphony when she can, given her busy schedule, and is just a delightful person. teaches, is a wonderful teacher, just a great colleague to have in the area. So we're really excited to feature her, let her step out in front of the orchestra. Saint-Saëns was often compared to Mozart in his abilities, his remarkable abilities at a very early age. Did all kinds of composing, was a very gifted pianist as a very young child, precocious. I think his big piano debut, he played some crazy hard performance and then offered to do any one of the Beethoven sonatas from memory as an encore. So certainly had that Mozart level ability as a child. Lived a long life, composed a lot of works. Very very romantic, even though he lived well into the 1900s. Actually, later in life was sometimes criticized for being sort of a throwback to the Romantic period, but certainly writes a wonderful melody, very very colorful orchestration. If you think of like his organ symphony, which we've done, really draws in a big orchestra with lots of really delightful colors. This piece is maybe not so much about orchestral colors. The orchestra really plays very much a background role. We get a couple little outbursts here and there, but this one is really all about showing off the violin. Saint-Saëns wrote a couple of pieces for a younger virtuoso of his day, Pablo Sarasate, I think wrote a concerto for him, and then wrote this piece specifically for Sarasate. It's got a little bit of, we might say, a Spanish flair. It's probably a little bit of a stretch to say that. It opens in a very operatic way with kind of a slow, sighing, mournful introduction, almost like a coloratura soprano. Then very quickly gets into this fast, a little bit syncopated rondo theme. The syncopation is why they say, well, maybe it's a little bit Spanish, and Sarasate was Spanish. Really delightful piece. Really hard for the soloist. And I think it's one of the reasons it's really hard is that, especially once you get into the rondo section, rondo is where you have a theme, kind of a main theme, and then you have something else, and then the main theme comes back, and then you have another something else. You keep coming back to that main theme. It's first of all, it's very fast. And it asks a lot of violin, just very fast, delicate playing, so sort of fits in with the texture of the concert. But a lot of not just fast notes, but jumping from really low in the instrument to really high in the instrument. And as opposed to playing a keyboard instrument where you can look down and you can actually see, which key you want to land on if you're jumping from low to high. The violin is more, we don't have keys, we don't have frets, so it's really knowing that fingerboard really well to know where you're going when you jump from really low to really high. That's one of the challenges of this. Fast, fiery, a lot of fun to listen to. Hopefully fun for her to play. Not easy, very very difficult, but a fast, fun, fiery piece.
Yeah, this is sort of what adds spice to our Scottish sandwich, right? So it's not quite so bland. Um, Spain was kind of in the air, right? There was, a similar time period. Carmen was written by Bizet. It's sort of, you can compare that to Mozart and the Turkish fascination that they had, right? There was sort of like Turkish instruments that they used in Magic Flute and some of his other, compositions. And then Spain was en vogue, right, during this time. And what I love is also there's almost like improvisatory improvisatory quality to it, right? It sounds like it's a virtuoso just showing off in the moment, but of course it's written down, right? But it's basically a tour de force in 10 minutes. How can you impress the audience with your amazing skill? There are no extra notes, right? 10 minutes, you just get raw passion and acrobatics on the violin. It's a really fun piece. Sometimes it's maybe performed a little bit too much. You hear it at competitions and recitals, especially in academia. I get to hear this a lot, sort of like work in progress while people are aspiring to be a virtuoso, but to actually get to do it with somebody where it's polished, that is really a treat. So I'm looking forward to doing that with Letitia.
Yes, and we're looking forward to letting all of you get to know Letitia better. So we're so glad she plays with us when she can. So I think that covers it for this concert. Thank you again for joining us. This has been an interesting challenge for us, for the two of us to plan. Johannes is currently in Bangkok, and I'm in Holland. So scheduling this one was a little bit more complicated than it usually is. We sometimes think California to Michigan is a hard time change to juggle, but this one was a little extra
It's
challenging.
yeah, it's
Johannes, what are you doing in Bangkok?
I was just telling Amanda I'm 12 hours ahead, so I can tell her the future, right? So I have a little residency at Mahidol University, which is like one of the major conservatories here, and a friend of mine is a conductor here, and she conducts the university orchestra, and she invited me to come in and do a very traditional program. So I'm doing Dvorak 9 and Mozart Magic Flute Overture and Mozart Flute Concerto. So with a Japanese faculty artist. So it's fun to be here. I would think of Bangkok being an exotic place, not Scotland, right? But back then, to Germans, Scotland was very exotic. To me, as a native German, Bangkok is much more exotic now than the British Isles, I would say.
Well, thank you all for listening. We're excited to see you on the 22nd. If you want to listen to any of this music, there are links in the program notes on our website, and we encourage you to do that to get to know the music. And we look forward to seeing you on the 22nd. Thank you.
Thank you.